person across the board that people said, go and speak to if you want to transition into this sector. Over the last 9 years, Mr. Alexander has literally been in the business of saving lives. Avahan, the HIV/AIDS prevention program in India, is started as one of the biggest public health private partnership successes in the world. It's the biggest HIV/AIDS program. $1 billion were deployed, and this program was specifically overseen by Bill Gates. Mr. Alexander ran it for almost 10 years. As a graduate of St. Stephen's College, the Delhi School of Economics, and then of IIM Ahmedabad, this is a man who spent 17 years at McKinsey & Company and then had the ability to walk away and seamlessly integrate into the world of injectable drug users, female and transgender sex workers, migrant populations, truckers, fishermen, and get entrenched to such an extent that at the time where I was looking at this organization, when he sent me on this trip to Bombay, the group of about over 600 transgenders in Bombay, they actually knew him by name. Mr. Alexander is also an avid painter and a national level chess player, and literally a gift to the country of India. Mr. Alexander, it's my real pleasure to introduce you as opening keynote speaker of our conference.
Thank you very much, Mihir. That's a very flattering introduction, and for now I'll pretend it's all very accurate. It's terrific to be here. I got here to Harvard a week ago. I'm on a senior fellowship at the School of Public Health, and I'm just delighted to be here. I'm actually honored with this invitation and a chance to interact with a great audience. The topic of the whole conference is very, very apt, very thought-provoking. The contradictions that exist in our country. As the conference materials point out, the contradictions of slums within shining cities, violence in a country which has a sectarian philosophy, and backward technology, all of these. I think that we cannot leave these at the rhetorical level. Say, gee, if we have all of these contradictions in our country, isn't that amazing? Because these are actually very cruel contradictions, many of them. And unless we have answers to why they exist and plans to solve them, it'll actually be a bit of a waste of time. I want to add something that I think is probably the most important contradiction that we have in India, which is the contradiction of our public health. Why is it then the country that is making strides internationally, seeks a place in the Security Council, agonizes why our growth rate is not 6.5 but only 6.2 this year? Why is it that 2 million children die every year under the age of 6? Why are our health outcomes worse than countries in sub-Saharan Africa, worse than our neighbors like Bangladesh and Sri Lanka? Why is it that 50% or most of our children are malnourished? Why are 70% of women anemic? It goes on and on. Why are there huge disparities between states in all of these sad statistics? So again, I say these questions, particularly in health, can't be left at the rhetorical level. It's difficult to compare between tragedies, but I would say health is right up there. Apart from the human tragedy, health has a direct impact on the development that we are all so proud of. A country that has 45 or 50% children malnourished, those children grow up into adults whose physical and mental development is not what it should be. They become part of a workforce which ultimately will not be as competitive. So you can establish a direct correlation. Amartya Sen and many others have done this, and I put it to you that this is one thing that we should be anguished about, and very often is not on our radar screen. So we need solutions. I think my experience in the last 10 years is that in public health there is a solution that comes from looking at the challenge as one of scaling up rather than reinventing wheels. I'll come to that in a minute, but I'd like to depict this challenge, if you will, in the context of a sort of a personal journey. What I learned, how I came to this idea of scale, the success we had in Avahan, and where we can go with that. So I just like to change to that segment. So, As Mihir touched on my sort of resume, about 10 years ago, I got an offer, proverbially the offer you can't refuse, kind of stuff from the Gates Foundation. And that's the reason I left. I was pretty comfortable in McKinsey, but it really was an offer I don't think anyone would refuse. It is an offer to try and create and scale up a program to stem the growth of the HIV epidemic in India. In 2003, the epidemic in India was giving real concern to experts around the world. There was a fear that we could tip into the African type of epidemic, very generalized. And just think about a country of our size, that would have been a global calamity. So when I got the opportunity to try and do this with very few guidelines, which was the best part, obviously anyone would have jumped at it. And I jumped at it at that stage. It's fair to say that my life changed in the last 10 years. I've left a life behind. I think I once worked in places where, my clients were businessmen. I've gone to a place where, as Mihir indicated, most of the sex workers in 6 states know me by name. Many are my friends. I worked in boardrooms. I moved to working in brothels all over India. And I worked in business, and now I work in a place where the main item of discussion was the rates for commercial sex in that particular location. So it's a good life. It's actually a much better life than I spent for 17 years, and I consider myself very, very fortunate. This iPad thing keeps going off. I'm not very good at this, but... So, you got to, I don't know how much you guys know about McKinsey and Company, but if you are tenured in McKinsey and Company, you fancy yourself a little bit of the master of the universe kind of thing. If a client asks you a tough question, your only dilemma is which one of 3 smart answers should you come up with. You're never stuck with anything. So, and so on and so forth. So when I took on this job, yes, certainly I was intimidated by the challenge, but inside me somewhere I said, this is another industry. You'll figure it out. You only have to scare people and tell them that you'll die if you don't use condoms, and so on and so forth. But I was in for a very rude awakening. I thought I was an expert on India. Part of my job as a director in McKinsey was to explain India, the contradictions of India, to people who came to India. They would all say, gee whiz, what an amazing country with these contradictions, and they'd go back home. And I didn't have a clue what I was talking about. I would point out these contradictions. But soon after I started, I plunged into field trips, because that's really the only way you can learn anything. And those trips took me to what I would call a third India. There's the first India we all belong to. There's a second India you see maybe from the window of your car as it glides along New Delhi. Beggars, people sleeping under flyovers. And there's a third India that I didn't know existed. So this was an India in very far-flung towns and villages, brothels in big cities, people who actually worked on the very edge of human misery, where a woman sold herself several times in a day for barely $1 a transaction, just to make ends meet, just to get through from morning to evening, who faced violence of every kind, who got none of the entitlements that a citizen of a country making great strides in the international arena should get. And I was quite devastated. I went through a set of feelings I can only analyze as shame and I don't know how to put it. There was certainly fear in it. Fear because the master of the universe was on a galaxy far, far away. He had no idea about this kind of problem, what to do with it. And I thought about what I'd left behind, a time of pretty good comfort. And when I started talking to the sex workers, I got even more desperate. So I would say the opening line I prepared so carefully, why don't you use condoms? You'll die if you don't use condoms. And the sex worker, she would say, why don't you tell us something new? Why don't you tell us something we don't know? If we die from HIV 10 or 12 years from now, I'd consider that a blessed life. Because that's a long, long time away. What happens in between is the challenge. So this went on. I came back to Delhi. Obviously, you can't live with feelings like that. You have a job to do. And I started discovering other things, as I'll see in a few minutes. I actually discovered that you can be inspired by the people, places, and situations that you come up with. and feel privileged. We didn't know much about public health. I had no clue about public health, HIV, or any of that stuff. So I did the only thing that you could do in that situation is create a team drawn from the private sector. I believed then and I believe now that business has the answers to nearly every problem. So I got a team from the private sector and we approached Avahan, and I think we can approach most of these scale problems with the notion of a business model. Now what does that mean? The first question we asked ourselves is, what is the solution to HIV prevention? And it occurred to us the solution is actually well known and fairly simple. If you boil it all down, you have to get people to use condoms, you have to communicate with them in a way that changes their behavior, you have to manage ulcerative STIs. It's a little technical, but if you have ulcerative sexually transmitted infections, they fuel the growth of HIV. HIV is a very inefficient virus. 1 in 1,000 becomes 1 in 5 if you have a parallel STI. You do these three things, and it's been well defined as a package. You scale up HIV. But there were experts who said, no, you have to find out which type of STIs really affect transmission, and so on and so forth. In a manner of speaking, they wanted you to invent a better condom. So we took the view, and I think this is a fundamental thing, question to ask, does the solution need refinement or does it exist? We said it exists, and we took the challenge as the scale up. And when we asked around, the experts said, actually Bill Gates has been fairly down in this whole program because HIV prevention, if you look around in the world, has never been scaled. The prime example is Thailand, which is a country about half the size of a state in India. It's never been scaled, it's never been scaled at the scale of India. And then as you look closely at the epidemic, you understood the reasons why. It's a concentrated epidemic, not generalized as in Africa. It's with these so-called high-risk groups, commercial sex workers mainly. Those commercial sex workers are not identifiable because largely we don't have brothels in India. Commercial sex is practiced at home. It's invisible because it's in the streets. Those sex workers are mobile. It's a moving, invisible target. And finally, as that sex worker indicated, she didn't want your product. Consumer doesn't want HIV prevention. She wants a safe life. Right? So it was complex, to put it mildly. But we went about this, I think, using very simple precepts of business. There was no rocket science in what we did. The first thing we did was create a sales force. A sales force of 8,000 sex workers, practicing sex workers, who would be the people who delivered HIV prevention to their communities. And you could only do it that way because sex workers talk to sex workers. And you have to speak their language. The second thing we did was the use of data. The Indian epidemic was largely a data-free epidemic. Nobody really knew how many sex workers were there in a community, how many transgenders, what is the level of transmission, how many partners does a sex worker have. You don't have basic data if you want to do prevention. There was no data. So the frontline sales force was generating data using very creative tools. Because remember, these women are largely illiterate, highly marginalized, and so on and so forth, using very creative tools, like a bindi on the head and a diagram meant that a woman was not using a condom, and we'll get into all of that some other time. It's fascinating in and of itself. But I think the single thing that we did, and this was critical, was to give what the consumer wanted. Go back to that conversation when the woman said, I don't care for your prevention stuff. The follow-up question was, what do you want? And the woman said, I want freedom from violence. And that was where the desperate feeling had come in and said, how can you solve a societal problem? Actually, it was solvable fairly easily. If you really asked, what do you want to get free from violence? And then sex workers said, we want a safe space. So we created safe spaces. We had community centers all over the place, which were just small rooms. Maybe you could have 3 in this space, or 4 or 5, depending. It was a safe space, that's all it was. You told the sex workers, you can come here, you're safe. The landlord won't harass you, the cops won't, because we work with those people. And you can have a shower, you can rest, and you can get a little education on HIV. You can get your supply of condoms. So these safe spaces by themselves began to be places where these invisible, movable people started flocking. The second thing we did after that was to create crisis management teams. Now this is a very simple learning. It only takes a group of 12 women to make any bullying man step down. So every time a sex worker was picked up by the cops or somewhere, we used the mobile phone, the sex worker would hit a number, and they'd come and work on, diffusing the situation. These crisis response, and people flocked to the violence reduction program, not the HIV program. And our program mushroomed. You could say, we didn't really need a lot of credit for this. We did some very simple things and it became viral. These things started mushrooming all over the country. In 2.5 years, in a situation where I said prevention doesn't work in HIV, in 6 states from Manipur to Mysore, in more than 650 towns, we were putting out 13 million condoms a month. And we had an impact. Avahan today is credited with averting something more than 400,000 infections and contributing to the national impact. So we're very proud of that. When I say we, not me and my team, we are proud of the communities who led this stuff. And that's very, very important. In public health, it's the consumer who must lead the charge on all of this. Shut off again. So what did I learn? I'll just conclude with a few remarks on this. Yes, I should mention one thing. If you have a program of this scale and size, it has to be sustainable. There's a very cruel vacuum that you will leave if your donor steps out of a program after 5 years or 6 years. So we worked on an entire process to transition Avahan back to the government of India, and it's now with the government of India. I think there's only 5% of Avahan left. And hopefully after 5 years, that nobody will remember the name, and that is success. To give it back to the mothership. So my learnings are the following. I mean, the first is that one of the biggest inequities in our country is health. I really, really hope every person goes away from this conference feeling that it's got to be on top of any list of contradictions, cruel contradictions. That these inequities have to be addressed with an articulation of the solution and the definition of a program that can solve the problem. And in our case, that was scaling up. I suggest that scaling up, not improving a solution, is important all over public health, and it may be important in other fields of social development. So you return the model on the head. Business principles are relevant. But most importantly, I think communities have the answer. Everything that we did, from that conversation sitting on the floor of the sex worker who said, give me something I need, the sequence of questions answers came from the community. The wonderful bindis and all those tools didn't come from a bunch of smart guys at the Gates Foundation. They came from those illiterate women. And I don't think that we pay in public health in India, at least, enough respect to the consumer. We have programs where you throw commodities at a sort of brainless consumer, assuming that they'll take them. You build tiny, excellent programs that win international awards. It's a bit like, it's called the hope model. You hope somebody else will scale them up, and it never happens. So I started feeling towards that I needed to leave now, because there is an opportunity to do, if you can, as the song says, if you can do it in HIV, you should be able to do it in other places. Go back to the 2 million kids who are dying. Why can't you scale up breastfeeding? Why can't you scale up vaccines? Why are these things as difficult? Should they be more difficult than HIV? So I'm here at HSPH to try and teach this stuff in the form of a course on scaling up public health intervention. I mean, fantastic if any of you sit in on that. I've also created a company which is 2 weeks old called Antara, because I think there's room for an organization that does all of this, but that's another story. I'll stop here, and I'd really love to have any questions. How are we doing on time? Yeah.
I have a question with regard to the process of scaling up for you. You did mention that you started out and then you managed to reach 13 million condoms being distributed across 600 cities. Was there a tipping point that you reached, and if so, how did you get to that tipping point?
Yeah, I think this is a good question. I actually have become a total believer in this tipping point notion. Somewhere along the line, I found that we didn't have to push the notion of violence, that it came back at us. And I think I can only explain it by enough conversations happening and the network having reached a certain level. Of course, it's good when you run a program, take credit for all of this, but it was happening from the community.
Thank you, Mr. Ashok. You are doing a wonderful job. I want to thank you. My question is, just now you told us you transitioned the program to government. As you know, whichever the program which is doing very well, once you transition to government, it will run out of the steam. This is a natural phenomenon. So how you are ensuring it will stay in the right course?
Yeah. So there are two things. We don't have a choice. If you're working on scale in India, you have to work with government. So the choice is only when you work with government, in the beginning of a program or at the end, like in Avahan, build, operate and transfer. So when we went to the government about 3 or 4 years before we entered, and we had a very enlightened health secretary at that time, and she said, this is a great program, but we don't have the wherewithal to absorb this kind of technology. So we actually worked with government in parallel, a side program to build the capacity of the National AIDS Control Organization. The same methods and so on and so forth. And it actually worked, you know. That kind of approach does work. And that's why I think that our programs are in good shape, in good hands with the government right now. Yes?
Hi, thank you. I think Avahan has been a wonderful program. I work for the Mental Health Access Initiative. So a little bit familiar with HIV. My question is, when it comes to a lot of public health problems, HIV, or if you look at, lack of breastfeeding or diarrhea amongst children, all these things, a lot of the root cause is because of lack of information, or which is the reason why it's mostly the really, really poor economic part of society which is plagued with problems. So in my head, when I think about what's the solution, I think of ultimately if you really want to get rid of these things, it has to come with economic equity within society. Otherwise, if there are... So economic disparity is one of the reasons why there is public health disparity. So in the long term, what's the solution towards really getting to a place where we're not plagued by these public health problems in the long term? So we should keep having programs in the short term which we're sort of putting out the fires in the short term, but in the long term, how do we get to a point where there isn't this disparity and there aren't all these problems, and what role can you think business play in that?
Yeah. Well, I think it's a good question. I mean, you're asking about proximal and distal factors in any health situation. And there will always be proximal and distal factors. We were working on the proximal factors. The distal factors would how you have a society where sex work itself is not needed at this level. How do you have a society where there is more gender equity, where a woman has the power to tell her mother-in-law that I have to breastfeed or whatever. So you have a choice as when you're running a program. If you either do one and partner with people who do the other, or you try to do either small programs in one and dabble a little in the other. I don't think ultimately you need this societal problem, but it may take 5 years, 10 years, or 20 years. I mean, who knows? A lot of people have asked me, or I've heard that they're saying, why is Avahan working with sex workers? Why don't they get women out of sex work? Why do women make this terrible choice in the first place? And the answer really is they don't make a choice. It's simply that they don't have a choice to make. That's the situation. And we don't take the view that sex work should be gone from society. Of course it should. But can we do anything about it? It's been there for a few thousand years, I believe. So some of these things will take a long time to work. There are very good people working on those areas. And I think that's probably the answer is partnership. You have to be clear what you're working on. We were working on proximal factors.
Hi. My question is to do more with health and broader development sort of evaluations. How do we, in your experience, how should the Indian government be pressured to put in more concurrent evaluations of the large-scale programs that it's rolling out? I think my concern is that the Indian government is rolling out a bunch of programs, but not setting up systems to measure if they're working or not.
Yeah, so your question is about evaluation?
Yes.
How can you do good program evaluation, or get the government to do it, especially? Well, even on government, I think there's a whole topic on program evaluation in public health, even by private programs, right? So really the broader question, how do you do effective evaluation, specifically in delivery programs? That's the real challenge. You can evaluate by randomized control trial on a scale program, if nothing else, there are ethical issues involved. When there's mobility of sex workers, you can't exactly attribute where your program had the particular impact. I think though that there are things that you can do. It's a big topic, so I'll just say one or two things. You have to look at contribution rather than attribution. And you have to measure certainly. In Avahan, we did everything possible. We had mathematical modeling. We took 25,000 blood samples. We did behavioral measures. So it's a cop-out. A lot of people cop out by or hide or claim credit without having evaluation, but they just say it's very difficult. The Bush administration had something called the ABC program, Abstinence, Be Faithful and Use Condoms, which worked in Uganda. But we don't know whether it worked. There's no evaluation at all. And so on and so forth. It's a big topic. We're happy to talk offline on that.
Good morning. You mentioned a couple of things. You mentioned the importance of communities in what you did, and you also mentioned the concern that you had about making it sustainable. And at the end of the day, you found that the answer to that was government. But my question is, if you saw that communities were playing such an important role, why not transition it to communities? Why not were you able to create a knowledge body that communities from all across India could gain from and replicate, so scale it by replication?
Okay, that's again a fantastic. This is why we're at Harvard. Great question. So there are actually, this is what you want to do when you cut everything to a few minutes. Two prongs to our sustainability. One is government. The other is actually communities who own and run this thing. So the idea is that we have created networks of sex workers in all over India, right? From district to state level, massive networks. And the idea is that through the structure, there's a governance structure. They elect office bearers and so on. They get a seat at the table with government to negotiate their rights as citizens of India for better health and so on. So that's community mobilization. They work in groups that stand up against violence. And these things have really started having an impact. But if you ask me, and what do I lose sleep about with Avahan, it's exactly this. These are highly marginalized communities. I already hear that the government doesn't set great store on community mobilization. And that's, in a way, a tragedy. Because these communities, in my view, will need sustaining for a lot of time and a lot of effort. And the benefits of the greatest guidance I've taken from this program is from Bill Gates, who came in very early, I think, in the first year of the program and said, this is not an HIV prevention program. This is a program of giving a lot of very unfortunate people better lives. And the social capital we built out of this is far more than any infections averted. And I think we have to look at that, and I think this is what I worry about, whether that is sustainable.
One final question?
Sure. Very inspiring piece of work. One broad question I have is, India is after all a democracy. Why is it difficult to solve these problems in a democracy? Do you have any broad opinions of, after all, you're in the Kennedy School, so?
And it goes back to the conference questions, why do you have slums and spanning cities and so on? You can answer this many, many ways, and I'm very proud to be an Indian. I'd be an Indian, if I had 10 lives, I'd always be an Indian, every single time. And I'm proud that we have a democracy, which actually works at the grassroots. What we did was but we're still only, what is it, hardly half a century old as a democracy. Places like America and the UK have had democracy for hundreds of years, and democracy takes seasoning and development. I mean, that's my, macro view of it. We're a struggling democracy, but I believe it's the only system. These problems will exist. We as people who have had the benefit of better educations and privileges, we have to figure out how we can solve these problems. As a last word on this, I really hope this conference will yield tangible ideas to work in different areas of cruel contradiction. Thank you very much.